Placebo, the podcast where each week we try and teach each other something interesting about healthcare and medicine. I'm Logan Richards, and this is my sister.
And I'm Kaylin Richards.
And today on Placebo, I'm going to steal an idea from Freakonomics Radio, which is another podcast.
Yeah, a much more well-known podcast.
Perhaps. Slightly more well-known. And I think they stole this idea from someone else, but we're going to steal it from them.
There are no new ideas? Is that what you're saying?
No.
No.
And while we're on the topic of ideas, this idea that they have is they do shows sometimes called This Idea Must Die.
Oh, no.
Meaning it's a idea...
very aggressive.
It is kind of aggressive, huh? But it's the idea that there's some type of either outdated or no longer useful idea that we use that we perhaps use too commonly and we need to reconsider it. Does that make sense?
5-second rule?
That's probably one of them.
Okay.
The idea that we're going to talk about today is the measurement of body mass index in the healthcare system.
BMI, yes.
BMI. Do you know about BMI?
It's to do with your height and your weight, and you get some sort of number. And I know they do use it because I'll see it in people's report, like surgical reports, for example. They'll say, like, this patient has a high BMI, therefore the surgery is more complex because of
Right.
It's more difficult to do the surgery on them.
Yeah. It's used all the time, and perhaps it shouldn't be, is what we'll talk about today. Most of the time you go to the doctor and they take your height and weight, they're calculating a BMI. So it's a number that's incredibly common in its use in medical charts for healthcare professionals to use as a piece of data about you, I guess. But it's also something that has a lot of controversy around whether it's useful at all, whether it measures what it says it's measuring. And I think, as you probably have the idea, based on my introduction, it perhaps is something that we no longer need to be using.
What is it? Because so it gives me a number. It's like, I deleted it now. I don't remember or I closed the window. But it's like...
So the BMI is...
It's not a number that I recognize as relating to my height or weight.
No. It's calculated by taking your weight in kilograms and dividing it by your height in meters squared. So basically...
your height in meters squared?
Meters.
Just meters.
You square that.
Okay.
Okay. So... it's in the metric system because it was developed in Europe, which we'll get to.
Okay.
Basically,
yeah, we don't believe in that metric system over here.
Perhaps the empirical measurement system is another idea that must die.
Well, probably.
So basically, what it's used for these days is a measurement of body fat percentage, kind of. So the number that it gives you is this arbitrary ratio, basically. And as you said, the scale goes from 18.5 and below is what they classify as underweight. And then 30 or above is what's classified as obese. And then there's a few categories in the middle with supposedly a healthy weight ranging between 18.5 and 24.9.
It's a pretty big range.
So it's not a direct, it's used to kind of estimate body fat percentage, and then it's even kind of further extrapolated into just health in general, if that makes sense. BMI is often brought up as a risk factor for developing types of diseases. Okay, so BMI is used to try and figure out, give an estimate of body fat percentage, and then even further just give an estimate of general health. So the idea being that a extra high BMI or an extra low BMI might be a reason for a risk factor for a disease. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it's often given with like cardiovascular disease. So but it can almost be with anything. A risk factor for any type of disease is either an extremely low BMI, meaning you do not have enough body fat, or an extremely high BMI, meaning you have too much.
Right. Either way is bad for you.
So the obvious controversy here is that BMI, which you've already pointed out, perhaps doesn't do a very good job of giving an overall estimate of health, and might not even do a very good job of giving an overall estimate of body fat.
Because when I did it just on the calculator there, it did not ask me if I was male or female. And a male who was the same height as me, I would expect to have a much heavier bone structure and therefore weigh more.
Yeah, well, that's one thing, the male and female difference. Although I think the ratio is meant to kind of cancel that out.
I don't think it works.
But the other issue that kind of jumps out at me is, say you have someone who's particularly athletic and muscular.
Muscle weighs more than fat.
Right, that's both anecdotally true, and I think that's also actually, I forget what the exact ratio is, but a gram of...
fat is something that is floaty, floats on top of water, and like dense meat wouldn't float that well.
Okay.
Muscle.
Yeah, muscle weighs...
I just feel like
muscle weighs more than fat. But since BMI is technically trying to be a measurement of body fat, but all it takes into account is total weight,
right,
you could have a very low percentage of body fat and have a lot of muscle. Picture some type of strong athlete.
Not me. Don't picture me.
Maybe a bodybuilder.
Uh-huh.
This person might have a large BMI, even though in reality they don't actually have much body fat at all.
And they might be very healthy.
Right. Or they might not be, and we'll get to that later
okay.
too. So basically, the first thing about BMI is it's just so general. It doesn't seem, it seems like there's obvious workarounds and situations that we bring up where we have an exception to the rule kind of thing, exception to the scale that they've made up. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first point, is that, well, it's probably not measuring what it actually says it's measuring.
What is it actually measuring?
Well, it's just a little bit too simple for what it wants to measure.
Life is not simple.
So let's get into the history, and maybe we'll try and figure out why it's
I was going to say,
simple.
do you know who came up with it?
Yes.
That was going to be my next question.
The precursor to BMI was called I'm not going to be able to pronounce this name. Ooh. I think it's of French origin.
I want to try.
Okay, so
unless you want to.
Quetelet.
Quetzal. I need to see it. I can't do it for my...
Hold on.
Adolphe Quetelet? Maybe?
All right, we're going with Quetelet then. So the precursor to BMI was the Quetelet Index. Mm-hmm. And so Adolphe...
It sounds German if that's Adolf.
Well, it's got an E on the end. He's Belgian. So
okay.
Somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
And he invented it in 1832.
That's pretty old.
So that should give you...
that was before they used aseptic technique in surgery.
Right. So that should right away kind of spark some alarm bells in your head saying this measurement is probably not great.
May not be the best we can do anymore.
Because it was invented before they even had sterile surgeries. And other things that we've talked about before on this podcast.
It was maybe when they still did things like bloodletting.
Yes.
Leeches.
So, not to say that it being old is a reason for it not to work, but it was certainly made in a time where they didn't quite know exactly what they were getting at.
But I think maybe the point of our whole podcast is that there's continual scientific discovery and advances, and I would hope there would have been some scientific advances in this area since 1830s.
Yes, I would say it's easy to say that there has been some advances in medicine since the 1830s. So this, how did we decide to say it?
Quetelet?
Quetelet. This Quetelet guy, he's a Belgian, and in 1832, he decides, since he wasn't actually a healthcare guy, he was a mathematician, a statistician.
Oh, so that's why it's a ratio.
And an astronomer.
I love in the old times. They did like all the sciences. You
the
could
other
be a
cool
scientist.
the other
Do
cool
it all.
thing is that there were no journals they were developing, and so if you had a science thing, you just published a book.
Just read a book. So he's an author. He's
Yeah.
a astronomer. He could have fit in with our previous topic too.
So yeah, he wrote a book, and it was called like The Treatise of Man or something like that.
It's
And-
wide ranging.
Yeah, and the BMI, all he was trying to do with the BMI, they were just starting to get into having a more population based ability with numbers. Like he was.
Like census? What do you mean?
Yeah, they had just started doing census, and he was kind of the first guy to start taking these numbers of a larger population and trying to extrapolate into saying like what the norm is, kind of
So
thing.
he was an epidemiologist.
Sort of. He was really into bell curves. He was very interested to find out what the normal man was.
Okay.
And so this
It's an
is
odd idea to have.
in all this stuff that I read about him, I still couldn't like. I read a fair amount of how he created this index, and I still didn't get really like why or like what the point was.
Was he like a what's that called?
I think he was just into numbers, and he wanted to
You want
try
to know
and-
about the normal man?
He wanted to
Was
try
he not
and
interested in the normal woman or just the man?
Well, I guess we can assume from his time period he wasn't interested in the normal woman, but
Oh.
I don't know to say that. But
So he wanted to have a bell curve of all the different types of men?
yes, and he wanted to figure out what the exact normal was, like what the normal height and normal weight of a person was.
That's something that is still calculated, the average height for people from various
I
countries.
guess so. Yeah,
and
that's an
average
interesting
weight.
thing. But what he found with their census data, he was because he was a
They
mathematician.
don't call it normal man.
he was hoping for, and I think assuming that as you got taller, your weight would increase.
Well, sometimes.
Well, he thought it would increase linearly, and that's not what he found.
He found a bell curve?
He found that weights were all over the place and that there was a bell curve, and so that's why he developed this ratio, which he called the Quetelet index. And
Seems like it would be easy to just look at people and be like, well, that's a tall guy and he's a little bit heavier, and this is a tall guy that's not as
but
heavy.
I think at that time too, they didn't fully understand
Scales.
obesity and things like that.
No.
And obesity was also not seen as a detriment to your health, which it
Right.
at this point it is.
It's a sign that you're wealthy.
Right.
Is
so,
it still a sign at
So it
that
was a
time?
different. So it was obesity was treated differently then. So all he was trying to do was figure out what the normal man proportion should be, and so he came up with this ratio where you could take your body weight in kilograms and divide it by the square of your height, and that would give you your normal ratio on what the normal man should be.
How does he know that's what the normal man should be?
That's what he decided based on his bell curve.
Oh.
Okay. So after
But
that,
people have changed in size from that time.
yes,
Yeah.
you're pointing out all sorts of flaws, which are all good points. This whole thing is flawed, and that's what I'm trying to prove. None of it should make much sense.
No, okay.
Okay, so then what happened is after about 100 years later, after World War II, I think.
Oh, a little over 100 years later.
Yes. The man, from what it looked like from my research, the man that started MetLife Insurance, which apparently is a much older company than I realized, wanted to have a way to quantify the different weights of people for health insurance purposes. Or
It seems
I'm
sketchy.
not sure if that's the way that it worked even back then.
They were trying to look at like health risks when insuring someone.
I think so. And so I don't
Like
have a
life
great
insurance,
knowledge of the
maybe?
history of insurance, but
Maybe it's life
apparently,
insurance, and they're trying to decide if you're healthy or not.
apparently he was interested in this, and they wanted a way to quantify people that weighed too much or people that weighed too little or people that were right in the middle for insurance purposes. Beyond that, what that means, I'm not sure. And so then at this point, it was it was changed, the Quintet index was changed into what we now call the body mass index. But that wasn't until 1972 that it was officially made that way.
Was it used all the way along from Quintet until then, or did he just find an old book and decide to pull it up?
Yeah, well, I think they were using it in insurance, and it sounds like a select group of people knew about it since its invention in 1832.
1832.
Yeah, in 1832.
Right in those dark ages. They were really concerned. They were getting the plague, and they were really worried about body mass index.
And so after, if I'm getting my timeline right here, after World War II, and then as we kind of evolved into the 70s, it was beginning to become more of a need for us to be able to quantify body mass.
Okay.
And so that's why they ended up coming with changing the Quintet index into the body mass index, although the formula is still the same.
Oh, so they didn't update it. They just changed the name?
They just changed the name and then decided on the ranges that put you in certain categories. Mm-hmm. All right, so the first thing, I guess, with all this history that I'm trying to say is this body mass index has been around for a long time.
Yes.
And it's likely that some scientific advances have been made.
I think it's certain.
The Quintet character that invented the body mass index, or its precursor, wasn't even trying to measure body fat. He was just trying to quantify what a normal man should look like, whatever that meant in 1832.
Right.
And
in 1832, when people were different sizes than they are now.
Right. So there's all sorts of holes. Now, body mass index, there has been some research that has correlated it to things like body fat percentage and risk factors for certain diseases, especially cardiovascular diseases.
Well, probably a lot of the time, if someone has a higher BMI, they probably do tend to be bigger people, right? And
right.
More people are overweight than are super, super fit and just full of muscle. So I could see where that correlation would come from, but that still doesn't mean it's the best thing to do.
Right. Let's move on to a more current controversy, I think.
Okay.
That is probably a little bit more interesting. So about a year ago, 2015, I think, that
was last year. That's correct.
The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission,
mm-hmm.
which is a government agency of some sort.
You usually see that when you look at a job posting at the bottom, it'll say like an equal
we're
opportunity
an all
employer.
Opportunity, yeah.
Yeah, meaning
okay.
They don't discriminate, right?
Right. So they were proposing a law that was saying that an unhealthy employee could be charged up to 30% of their health care costs. Does that make sense? You're giving me a funny look.
I am giving you a funny look. I don't understand.
So
because either their insurance pays it or they pay it, right? So I don't.
Right. So, but you pay your insurance premiums, like when you have a job that is yes. supplying health insurance. You pay. That money gets taken out of your paycheck, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So basically what they're saying is that they could take more money from you.
If you were using your insurance a lot?
And they could prove that you were an unhealthy person.
Which you would assume you would be if you were using your insurance a lot.
I suppose so. So and they were saying, well, we can use BMI to determine this.
Not like if you're actually using it, but just like looking at your BMI and saying, oh, you seem to be unhealthy. You probably will be using more. Yeah,
they were saying that they could just take BMI and start charging that person more if their BMI was too high.
That sounds super sketchy.
So
also impeding on people's personal information.
I think there's a lot of issues, and I don't think that this rule actually is in effect at this point.
Mm-hmm. Better not be.
Right, because obviously people were upset about it, and so there was a group that did some research led by Janet Tomayama at UCLA, mm-hmm. and so they're from the psychology department at UCLA, and they wanted to kind of put an end to this BMI shenanigans. And so what they did is they wanted to figure out if BMI could actually be used to tell if someone was healthy or not.
Okay.
And they came up with some really interesting numbers.
And wouldn't it have to be consistent? I mean, they can't just say, well, in 75% of people, it seems to be a good correlation, but in other people it doesn't relate, right?
Yeah. Okay, so this study from UCLA had a fairly big population. What they did is they took data that had been gathered for the last several years from the U.S. National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is apparently something that gets sent out to a random sample of Americans.
I've never seen this survey.
We have not taken it. Neither of us have taken it. But it was 40,420 adults that they had access to.
Well, that's a pretty small percentage of the American population, but a large number for a study.
A large number for a study, yeah, for a healthcare study. Mm-hmm. It is survey data, so obviously
take it with a grain of salt.
Right. The numbers that they found were really interesting. So they found that 47% of the people who responded to the survey and had a BMI that put them in a category of overweight. Mm-hmm. So about half of those people who were overweight were actually healthy. So,
like in that they didn't have a lot of medical issues?
Right. So let me tell you how they measured this. They had 5 metrics, 6. They had 6 things that they measured that they were trying to use to independently prove health outside of BMI, basically.
Right.
So
or that there's not a correlation between BMI and health?
Right. They took other metrics like blood pressure and cholesterol and used those measurements against just the general calculation of BMI.
Okay, to see if they showed the same thing or not, basically.
Right. And so their claim was that their measurements of these other metrics could show that someone was healthy and that you can't just use BMI to also prove that someone is healthy.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So they found that about half of the people that were classified as overweight by BMI were actually healthy based on the metrics that they took themselves.
Based on their health numbers, kind of, right?
Right. And they found that 29% of the people who were in the obese category of BMI were also healthy based on those metrics.
Like they had good cholesterol, their blood draw was good numbers.
Right.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing.
For blood pressure, you said, right?
Yeah. They found that 31% of the people in the normal category were unhealthy based on the metrics. So basically what they've gone and done is saying in all the categories of BMI, there's a certain percentage that are either unhealthy or healthy, and that BMI has not done a good job at all at generalizing overall health of a certain type of person.
Sure, yeah. So basically there's no connection between BMI and if they're healthy or not in that study.
Pretty much. The big number that came out of this study is that if you extrapolate their percentages, all the numbers that they found, to the entire population of the United States, what they say is that if you were to only use BMI categories as your main indicator of good health, then an estimated 74,936,678 adults would be misclassified as either unhealthy or healthy. Does that make sense?
When they're the other, yes.
When they are the other. So it's a huge number of people.
That's a lot. What percentage of how many people are in the U.S.? That was a large number, so I'm assuming that's a large percentage.
74 million.
So it's about a quarter. It's 23%.
Okay, so that's pretty interesting. Basically what they're saying is that if you were to use only BMI to measure health, about 23% of people would be classified incorrectly as either healthy.
That was my guess before, a quarter.
Was it?
Yeah, I think so.
Good job. I don't even remember you guessing.
Yeah.
So here's what they're suggesting. What they say is that there's several problems with BMI. The first is that there are probably that it can't be used as a measurement to indicate overall health, and that there are probably better metrics to use.
There definitely are, because it seems wrong.
So, yeah, well, that's one thing. So, to sum this up, we've looked at the history. We realized that BMI
is super old.
We don't use it for what it was originally meant to be used for, which I'm not even sure is a relevant category anymore.
Yeah. Normal man.
And it certainly cannot be used to estimate someone's overall health for obvious reasons, but the most that about a quarter of Americans would be misclassified as either unhealthy or healthy when they were the other.
Now, in surgeries, when I see it used in medical charts, I wonder if it is still a little bit accurate, because what they're indicating is that the person has a lot of body mass that kind of complicates the surgery.
Yeah.
Whether it's fat or whether it's muscle, it still is complicating the surgery.
That could be correct. I think the only thing that BMI actually does is it gives you a ratio that relates height to body mass.
Yeah.
That's the only thing it does.
So it could be sort of semi-accurate or helpful in that
And
stage,
of course,
I
we are
guess.
not surgeons, so we don't know how useful that is, but it's perhaps useful to them.
Yeah, maybe. But in general health, no.
The other thing, though, is that this study suggests that if America focuses on BMI, it kind of puts this stigma on weight and obesity and overweightness.
Which is never helpful.
Which is never helpful, though. So they suggest that a much more effective strategy that would lead to probably healthier people is one that doesn't focus on weight and its relationship to your height, I guess, but one that focuses on healthy eating, lifestyle changes, appropriate exercising, things like that, things that people know are obviously good health habits, but don't have the stigma of what type of ideal weight you should be or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's something that doesn't help people to focus on.
So that's pretty much it. There's no reason to use BMI as an indicator of general health, and there's pretty much also no reason to use BMI as an indicator for body fat percentage.
It's not helpful, not accurate.
So whenever you see that measurement, you should consider why it's being used and make sure that it actually makes sense, or whether it's just kind of pushing on this negative stigma. Yeah, one of the things that I read on why are we still using this, because it is so common still, is just inertia, is what they were saying. Like, it's just an easy measurement that has always been used.
Since 1830.
Has continued to be used because we can make these kind of like rough correlations between random, risk factors for diseases and overall health, even though, and it might be harder to get all the better measurements like taking blood pressure, but also looking at lab values from a blood draw and things like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of, I think, black and white thinking, like, this is the number, these are two simple numbers, you are overweight, you're underweight, whatever your normal weight. And that's just not how the real world is. You need to have more information, you need to think more creatively, so I don't think it's just outdated.
Right. So in summary, BMI is probably doing more harm than good. And if you do see it used somewhere, just make sure that you consider why it's being used and that it's not always right.
So would you calculate your BMI, or would you never even look at it?
Well, no, it doesn't seem to be helpful.
Don't even look at it.
No, I don't find that it's a helpful number at all. Especially,
no, I don't either.
I'll post this study that I looked at. There's several other metrics that they talk about that are much better markers of overall health when used in combination. And BMI seems to just miss those things, likely because it's not actually looking at those things. So yeah, it doesn't seem like knowing or measuring your BMI is worth anything. And that also is true probably with weight, that those types of things can be used, but it shouldn't be the only thing you use.
Sounds good.
Okay.
I found this an interesting topic, especially because I know that people still use BMI quite a bit. It seems like they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this episode, please share us with a friend or give us a rating on iTunes.
You can visit our website, placebopodcast.com, for any of our show notes or sources, or to send us any suggestions or feedback.
You can also find us on Facebook, and you could give us a like there.
Thank you to James Aiken for our music.
And thank you to you for listening. We'll be back with a new episode next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.